All right, greetings from my kitchen studio in San Francisco, and welcome to BRC and Friends, a regular-ish 30-minute Google Hangout with me, Bruce Reyes-Chow, where I chat with friends and adventurers from around the interwebs. Today, I welcome to the show Emily Rice, an organizer, grad student, and co-founder of Killjoy Prophets. Hey, Emily. Everybody want to see Emily here? Hi, Emily. Glad to be here. Emily is an organizer focused on the intersections of racial justice, indigenous solidarity, feminism, and faith. She's a co-founder of the activist collective Killjoy Prophets and serves on the board of Evangelicals for Justice. She holds an MBA from Portland State University and is currently pursuing a master's in Intercultural Studies from North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies through George Fox Evangelical Seminary. Before we jump in and talk with Emily, just take a moment to check out all the links below in the YouTube stuff there. You can connect with both of us, and if you are watching this live or if you are going to tweet along later, you can tweet with me at breyes-chow or with Emily at pdxpinay, which is pdxpinay, and at Killjoy Prophets, and use the hashtag BRC and Friends. As usual, our time is broken up into 3 segments. First will be centered around the particular interest of my guest. In this case, we'll talk about Killjoy Prophets. Second, around something totally different so that we can kind of get a fullness of who we are. And then I'll do my last questions as I always do with some random questions. So we're going to go ahead and get started, though, and talk about Killjoy Prophets. So, I've known Emily for a little bit, and I know some folks who are involved with this, but I want... how did this start? Who's part of it? And I think folks want to know, how did it get named Killjoy Prophets? So can you just give us the basics, and then we'll dive into the issues and things.
Sure. Well, it's great to be talking with you, Bruce. So it's kind of funny how Killjoy Prophets came along. There were several people that I had connected with via Twitter, and one of them was Sui Park, and she was interested in doing a book group talking about the cross and the lynching tree. So we started thinking about how we might be able to do a Google Hangout on a regular basis talking about the cross and the lynching tree as people who identify as Christians but have always kind of felt in the margins as it related to our passions around feminism and racial justice. So we started this Google Hangout book group for a few months, going through the cross and lynching tree, and we realized a lot of us had similar interests and passions. And we just were so taken by the community, the feeling of community and sense of community that we were finding through these dialogues, and the space to think critically and talk critically about what we were seeing in Christianity, what was being talked about and what wasn't being talked about by Christian bloggers, for example, what books were coming out, how race is being discussed. All of those things were things that really we felt a lot of passion around and felt like were not addressed in the ways that we'd like to see. So I think all of us in the group have kind of this activist bent towards us. So we were like, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to take action? Because reading James Cone's book was incredible. It's a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it. If you haven't read it, this was my second time going through this book with the Hangout group. But so we wanted to put this into action, and so we just started brainstorming, like, what could we do? And I think one of the first things was putting a name to it, or like creating some kind of group identity. And I was having a conversation with one of the Killjoy Prophets members about, what would it look like if Christianity centered, itself around the perspectives of the Killjoys, meaning the feminist Killjoys. For those who aren't familiar with Sarah Ahmed and her work around kind of naming, she's got a blog called Feminist Killjoys, and it talks about that a lot. I recommend that for folks that aren't familiar with that. But centering the Killjoys and the prophets, so the people that are calling out empire in uncomfortable ways, calling out the things that the church and society don't necessarily want to hear, things that are uncomfortable. So we just kind of, those two kind of words really stuck with us, and so eventually we kind of came to call ourselves the Killjoy Prophets.
Great, thank you. Well, and from what I gather, just following you all in a variety of mediums, one of the shifts is it's whose voices, perspectives, and stories it's centered around. That's a particular difference. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that's going to be a little different than in some of the other ways we talk about faith and all this?
Yeah. So one of the things that we felt like was important was following a lot of the work of Andrea Smith and Indigenous feminists, women of color feminists. We felt like it was important to take a look at how we might address things from a women of color feminist perspective. And so that's kind of because several of us are women of color, identify as women of color politically, we felt like that would be a good starting point for us to start centering our perspectives. So that's kind of the place that we're starting. It's, I think, different from a lot of what you see in justice organizations that tend to go from a lowest common denominator. Let's find like what we all have in common. But sometimes when you take that approach, you miss out on those who are kind of the more marginalized voices already, more marginalized perspectives fall through the cracks in a lot of those cases. So if we were to, in keeping with this idea of feminist killjoy and the prophets, Killjoy Prophets, what if we were to center it from a woman of color perspective? Right. So that's kind of our idea around that.
So what should we expect, you know, and I'm sure it's going to evolve and change as you all do this, but what should we expect? Are we going to be reading a blog? Are we going to get videos? And are there, you know, kind of what, you know, if I'm going to follow you on Twitter and Facebook and all these places, will it be topic-based? Will it be just as folks are experiencing things? How do you expect the visible and outward kind of expression of Killjoy Prophets to be? What's that going to look like?
That's a great question. I think a lot of this has been really organic in how it's kind of come around. I mean, like 5 months ago, we probably didn't even know that we would have like a website that was being built or really a presence in terms of the group, the collective that we've become. So, you know, a lot of is still yet to be seen, but definitely I think we all find it's important for us to be engaging in a lot of the topics around systemic racism, patriarchy, a lot of these systemic issues that often don't get discussed within Christian circles. A lot of the time we see things that are more surface level, or, for example, one of the issues that we have talked about quite a bit is reconciliation, and that concept of reconciliation, and how that's problematic in that there's often with that a rush to just everybody, you know, getting along when we're not actually addressing a lot of the structural issues around white supremacy, anti-blackness, Orientalism, colonialism that come with those structural problems. So digging a bit deeper, provoking some of those difficult conversations, and taking action around that are definitely some of the things that we want to see happen.
Right. Well, you all have already written a bunch of good stuff out there, and I'll make sure I include all those links and everything. And then I also want to suggest the Crossing the Lynching Tree as well. I think, you know, folks need to read that. So I've been following those of you that are involved with this, and I will tell you that there are some times where I'm like, ooh, I'm provoked, like, you know, like my own kind of privilege and maleness, you know, and I like to think I'm a pretty liberated male, and try to examine all of that myself. But there are definitely times I'm like, ooh, I'm not sure I would do it that way, which isn't really the point. I mean, all of that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And I know that there's a lot of conversation about tone and civility and graciousness, and that, you know, how those things are different with everybody. And, you know I approach it in a certain way, and other folks get accused of things, all that kind of stuff. When somebody says to you, you know, it would be better if you were more civil, or you were more gracious, or, you know, those kinds of things, which I know you guys get. I know you all get that a lot. How do you respond to that, both as a challenge to interact, as well as a, well, what do you mean kind of thing? I mean, I know you've been thinking about that a little bit. How do you respond to those kind of critiques?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, I can't speak for everybody in the collective, but, you know, just speaking for myself personally, it is hard for me personally, because personality-wise, I like to get along with people. I like to be liked. So it's not easy for me to engage in difficult conversations. But that said, one of the things that I've learned over the years that I've been kind of trying to do this work, and have kind of come to the place where I've realized that, you know, just capitulating to, you know, easier conversations, or just saying things in a more gracious way, we forget that the pain and the anguish and the oppression is still there. So covering things over with gracious words that folks who benefit from privilege because of the structural realities, it's not being fair still to those who have to live under the pain of that oppression. So a little bit of uncomfort on my part, and I think on other people's part, is a very small price to pay to actually start to hopefully make some change to some of those long-standing structural dynamics that maintain oppression.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's very helpful. I always, you know, part of me, the way I deal with it when somebody says something is like, I don't take it personally, but then part of me says, but actually I should, right? There's like, how do you both take it personally so it changes, like you're being challenged about something in your privilege, but also not to overwhelm where it's like, oh, this person now hates me because they're challenging my privilege. And, you know, I think that's a really difficult place to sit a lot of times. But so let's talk, you know, I know one of the things that you all challenged is around the Asian American community and kind of this the difference. And I want to bring this up because I think that one of the ways racism still exists out there, especially in progressive communities, is believing that every people of color group agrees and about issues and topics. And I will, you know, I'm one that during political times I'll see Asians on TV, you know, doing anti-immigration stuff, and I'll yell like, "You are not being a good Asian, right?" And do I get to define what is Asian? No, I don't get to do that. But I know there's been some conflict sometimes around within the Asian community around how to approach faith and Christianity and this whole idea of reconciliation to a white church, or are we supposed to, you know, those kind of things. Talk a little bit about how you handle, because I know a lot of folks involved in the collective right now are Asian, how you handle that tension within a community that we want to be in solidarity together, but yet we don't always agree about tactics or issue or other things. How have you handled that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think this is something that, you know, I still want to see continue to develop, and I want to have more conversations, especially among other Asian American folks. You know, I identify as a Filipino American, and sometimes I don't necessarily feel as part of, you know, the larger Asian American community. Maybe you get some of that too.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, that is the closest kind of, you know, racial group that I, you know, feel like I fit into. So under the current, you know, sociological constructs. But so one of the things that you know, a lot of us, the Asian folks in Killjoy Prophets, really had concerns about when we see anti-Asian Orientalist sentiment come up, especially among like evangelical white church leaders. Oftentimes there's rightful like outrage about that, and I think that it's important that we speak out about that. But it's also important for us to be aware of how we do that. How do we engage in those conversations about race in a way that doesn't presume or further issues that are faced by other racial minority communities. And one of the ways that I've seen that happen, and I know that for the most part there's no intent there. There's no intent to minimize the suffering of black folks, for example, but oftentimes people think, Asians think, and I know I've been there before, that if our oppressions aren't recognized or represented among the ideas of what is racism, then the race issue is not going to get fixed. And we'll say, oftentimes you'll see Asian Americans say, well, at least folks are talking about racism against black people, or that's so much further along. We've been addressing racism against black folks, but nobody talks about racism against Asians. And I feel like we do ourselves a disservice when we don't understand race and white supremacy and how that functions in ways that are different for black folks, for Asian folks, for Native folks, Latino folks. And so one of the key things that those of us in Killjoy Prophets have kind of coalesced around is Andrea Smith's Heteropatriarchy and the Three Pillars of White Supremacy. That's an excellent piece, and for folks that haven't read that or aren't familiar with that, I highly recommend reading that because it frames the problem of white supremacy and systemic racism in a way that helps to delineate how racism functions differently within different communities. And so as people trying to resist racism and address how racism impacts our communities, say as Asian Americans, we don't want to be further piling on to anti-black sentiment or appealing to whiteness in order to be recognized by white folks as our way to address our racial oppression. We need to be going deeper and addressing the systemic issues so that all of us are able to fight this racial oppression.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we fall into this trap of these kind of oppressional Olympics where we need to be recognized just as much as someone else. But I think that whole difference is really important. I used to write a column for an Asian American magazine, which I will not name, and I wrote a column just about that, about what is Asian privilege, and how do you look at being Asian as opposed to being, and they edited it out so bad that I told them to take my name off of it. And it was very interesting to kind of get the pushback on, what do you mean there's Asian privilege, or what do you mean this different than here? We're just like, and like, well, we're not. I mean, our histories are different, and then you don't even talk, the whole Filipino versus other Asian groups. Then it was like, oh, don't even go there. So yeah, I mean, I think, what I hope is that we continue these conversations, right? You just keep engaging and in some way modeling how we can do this. Like we can challenge each other and still be in community. So
exactly.
Now a lot of this happens on Twitter, and I know you're active and Sue's active. Mihi and some other folks are very active on Twitter. Why do you think it's so effective? I mean, what about Twitter do you think, as opposed to the algorithms on Facebook that don't let us see anything negative on Facebook, but yet on Twitter, it seems that so much of these movements are happening and being sustained and supported on Twitter. Why do you think that is?
I'm probably not the best person to ask about that, but I could just tell you from my experience, Twitter was great because I was able to connect very easily with other people that had similar kinds of concerns. I learned from people that maybe I didn't initially kind of agree with, but learned a lot from, especially folks within Black Twitter. Black feminist perspectives really impacted how I started processing these these issues. And otherwise, I live in Portland, Oregon, right? So, which, is not all white, like some people think if you watch, like, a Portlandia episode.
Right. I'm going to ask you that.
Okay. But, there's a diversity of perspectives, and you have the ability to center perspectives of folks that generally you can't really find as centered in mainstream media and other areas of media. So I also was able to connect with people like Sui about some of our shared concerns around the Asian American Christians United open letter. That was actually the catalyst for she and I connecting and talking. So I think Twitter, there's definitely a way to connect with people who are not, in terms of proximity, close to you, but you can share some dialogue, you can make connections, and actually develop friendships and relationships with people, in different places, especially for folks that there aren't a whole lot of people who would willingly identify as a Killjoy prophet, as I described it, but the fact that this is much broader than just my area in Portland, Oregon. I can connect with a lot more people who do.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I mean, I'm obviously a big social media person. I think one of the things we'll have to figure out is how. I was just at a conference teaching a little bit about social media, and I was talking about these movements and listening, from if you remember, Black privilege to more recent ones and all of those, and I'll say like 90% of the people in the room had never heard of them. I mean, I think that's good. That whole centering is how do we move the power of that out into a kind of a broader kind of just visibility, if not knowledge. I think that's going to be a shift, but I think you're right. It centers yourself in a way that you can't do anywhere else. I think it's great.
And that's not even to I didn't even really talk much about hashtags and how
exactly.
You can have these really broad conversations about specific topics in really powerful ways. But I know folks like Sui could talk a lot more about that.
Good. I was trying to get together with her. I was just in Chicago, and we couldn't quite make it work. But I'm looking forward to kind of seeing her get right back into. I know she's doing a little more speaking and stuff as well. All right, so this goes pretty fast. I want to make sure we get to some other things. I always do a second segment that kind of talks about other stuff because you're not just Killjoy Prophets. You're Emily Rice, who has other interests and passions and areas of expertise. And so I always ask folks, like, okay, something totally different. And yours was karaoke.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I will say my first reaction was, wow, could she be more Filipino? Was kind of like, I mean, we have a karaoke machine in our house. You go to the Philippines every day. So how long have you been karaokeing, and what's your go-to song?
My whole life I have been karaokeing. I am the quintessential, stereotypical Filipino American. So I've actually been singing probably since I was 3 years old, and I love singing. And actually, my undergrad was in vocal performance music. So singing's been a big part of my life, but definitely the growing up as a Filipino, having the karaoke machine at home. I think my go-to, it depends on my mood, but a more recent kind of go-to for me is when I'm feeling militant, especially, is MIA's Paper Planes.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah.
So
I also do, like the Whitney Houston or the Janet Jackson, the ballads that I grew up singing my heart out to.
So you're the one that we go. Everybody goes out karaokeing, and then you go up there and you make the rest of us not want to sing anymore, right? You're what we have friends like that, and we're like, seriously, you're gonna bust out in Whitney Houston? I'm not singing. That's not gonna happen. I know. Yeah, that's what you're. So, is there much karaoke in Portland?
There's quite a few, like bars, karaoke bars. I actually don't get to go out karaokeing as much as I'd like to. My sister is like a big karaoke fan too. Obviously, she grew up in my family, so has a shared love of singing. And but she recently moved, so I don't have a karaoke buddy. So that could be something if they're, wannabe karaoke buddies that I can hook up with in Portland.
This is where it began.
Yes.
The karaoke mafia started right here.
Yeah.
And so Portland, I want to ask you a little bit about Portland. So, Portlandia, that whole thing, people say it's a little bit like it, but, but I have a lot of friends who moved there, and there is this image, and I think it was because there was a article maybe 2 or 3 years ago that talked about, for its size, Portland was one of the whitest communities in the country. So, but I know you're there, and I have some other friends that are of color that are there. What is it really like there, or is it a matter of just where you are and the perspective in which you decide to see it? I mean, what's the diversity like in Portland?
Yeah, it's complex. I mean, definitely, Oregon has had a very dirty history as it relates to race.
Yeah.
As a lot of places, well, pretty much everywhere in the country has. But from the settling of Oregon, the Oregon Territory, there was intentional effort to make Oregon a white homeland. So, displacing the native folks, not allowing black folks to live here. There were Chinese exclusion laws. So, there's all that history of the lack of settlement by people of color.
Right.
However, there are, it's not to say Portland is all white. I mean, I think Portland, the city itself, is about, almost 30% non-white, and so, it's still a significant number, but there definitely is that sense culturally, I would say, that Portland's a very white community, and I think what really builds on that is this image that gets perpetuated of Portland as this kind of white hipster, Mecca, the place like young people go to retire, young white people go to retire.
Exactly.
And so there is you see a lot of gentrification, especially in areas that were historically black in Portland. So, Portland has a really difficult kind of history and current kind of relationship around race right now. And you'll actually see that there's a higher percentage of people of color now. This is the trend. They're moving out to the suburbs.
Oh, interesting.
So, yeah, as opposed to going into the city. Now it's more white folks are kind of migrating into the city from other areas of country, and then folks of color are moving out to the suburbs. So
and that's actually very similar to San Francisco in a lot of ways. So that's interesting. All right. Well, good to break down some of my images of Portland. I got in trouble actually for saying that Portland was so white from a friend of mine that was there. She was highly offended. We've made up since then. All right. So we're at the end of our time, which is great because this goes so fast. And thank you for hanging out. But you don't get to leave yet. I got my questions for you that I ask every guest. So here you go, and you can just answer it as brief or as with explanation if you want. But all right, a sound or smell that reminds you of your childhood.
Yikes. Fried lumpia.
Oh yeah, I just had some today.
Oh, lucky you.
All right, first concert that you ever attended.
Oh God, Debbie Gibson.
Oh, are you kidding me?
Not kidding you.
He is like my. Are you kidding? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
But
then it was closely followed by Janet Jackson, which was far superior.
Oh, well,
yeah.
They're just different. They just speak the different parts of the soul. All right, so wow, I knew that we had this connection this day. Okay. What was your first or your worst job?
My worst job was as a summer job. I was actually working as a contract kind of student worker at Intel, and it was so boring. There was nothing for me to do other than count paper. It was so mindless. the day would not go by fast enough.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. You get to switch places for one day with any person in the world. You get all of their talent, their resources, and their connections. Who would it be?
I don't know. It'd be interesting to be Beyonce.
That's awesome. You never know where people are going to go, right? Are they going to go entertainment? Are they going to go political? Or were they? I love it. I'm going to switch with either Adam or Blake and be on The Voice. That's mine.
Nice.
So, and last question is pay it forward a little bit. Is there an organization or a group that you think more people should know about?
Yeah. So Eagles Wings Ministry and Elahe Farm is an organization that Randy and Edith Woodley, who live out in Newburgh, which is kind of in my area, but they have an organization where they nurture Indigenous leaders. They look at building regenerative farming, and so they're doing really great stuff. Randy is also a professor of missiology at George Fox Evangelical Seminary, so he's great.
Yep. All right. Thank you. And everybody knows I'll include all the stuff on the recap, all the books you've mentioned and blogs, and people will make sure that all those links are there. So thanks, Emily, for hanging out with me tonight. I'm glad you could be here. And so thanks to everybody else for hanging out with this episode of BRC and Friends. I want you to be sure to check out the episode recap on Reyes-Chow.com. I'll include all the links again for today's episode. Take a moment to subscribe to the YouTube channel, which is going to show up right there. And also make sure you connect with Emily and Killjoy Prophets and all the things they're doing. All those links are also listed below. So, again, thanks for everybody hanging out tonight. And until next time on BRC and Friends, please keep talking because there are times when silence is not an option. We'll see you next time.